Welcome to the ReRooted podcast with Francesca Maximé, trauma-sensitive mindfulness meditation teacher and poet. Together, we'll take a closer look at approaches to transforming trauma with insights from psychology, neuroscience, spirituality, social justice, and the creative arts. Join Francesca and her guests for an exploration of our shared connection and how we can cultivate greater compassion for ourselves and for others. If you'd like to support Francesca and the ReRooted podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Francesca.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the ReRooted podcast here on Ram Dass's Be Here Now Network. So glad to have you join us. It's a fall day, November 2019, at the time of this recording. And my guest today is a guest that I have interviewed previously, someone I really respect and appreciate and love dearly from the heart, although I don't get to see him that much because he's on the road all the time, sharing Dharma and living embodied practice. Lama Rod Owens. He's considered one of the leaders of the next generation of Dharma teachers, and he has led a formal Buddhist training and life experience that gives him a unique ability to understand, relate, and engage with those around him in a way that is spacious and sincere. His gentle, laid-back demeanor and willingness to bare his heart and soul makes others want to do the same. And I'm going to stop there because I'd rather spend more time talking to him, but you can go to lamarod.com to find more out about him and his whereabouts, and let's just sort of dig into some of the doings. Hi.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure, really.
Yeah.
I'm excited because I think you were one of the first podcasts that I did when it was sort of flippantly named Wise Girl at the time. I was just sort of like, let's try to get into our inner wisdom, our inner wise child. And now that it's on Be Here Now Network, which I know you've appeared on for other podcasts and stuff, it's called ReRooted. And it's about rooting ourselves back down into sort of our essential essence and our collective essence, which would be, in this metaphor, I guess, the earth that holds us all and, our sort of intertwining roots and things like that. And I guess we might just want to dive in with that because Racine, R-A-C-I-N-E, of course, is sort of the word for root, but it also is the root word of race and racism.
Yeah.
And right, which I find so intriguing. And I guess because that's some of the work I've been doing lately, and I know a lot of the work, it's been a lot of the work I've been doing lately, and it's definitely the work that you do in terms of interrogating constructs and stuff around that. Maybe we can touch on that and maybe some issues around gender sexuality, and around, or, sort of self-acceptance, body image, how we present in the world, and all these other kinds of things. So open convo.
Okay.
So first things first, you're in LA. You just kind of wrapped up a retreat. Tell me what was happening there.
Yeah. I've been out in LA for about 5 days or so. And, I've been pretty much hustling ever since I got off the plane a week ago. I've been working with Inside LA this year. And this is my third time coming out to offer programs with them. And when I come out and do like a residency with an organization, I love to, teach with a lot of different kinds of groups and a lot of different kinds of people. So last Friday, we started out with a people of color evening sit and Dharma talk, where we explored gender, sex, and we also really got into the teacher-student relationship, which we could call professional boundaries, ethical misconduct, boundary crossings. That was a very fruitful exploration, and all this can be found on Facebook, on the Inside LA Facebook page, where all of these talks have been recorded. And
Great.
Saturday, I did a one-day retreat workshop with people of color, and we explored what I call the Dharma of Homecoming. And for me, the Dharma of Homecoming is actually, how do I find a home in the world, and where's that home at, right? And how do I do this really radical work of homemaking, and I think that's so deeply dharmic. That's so, when I say dharmic, I think that it's a deep expression of wisdom, of clarity, of compassion. I just think it's a radical act. It's a revolutionary act to make a home in a world, particularly if you felt that the world has not ever been a home for you. And I love
Yeah.
offering these teachings for people of color and for people, who experience marginalization every single day like we do. Um, and so on Sunday, I taught a few sessions with Trudy Goodman, who is the guiding teacher for Insight LA, and one of the senior pioneer teachers in the generation of American Buddhists here. And then that afternoon, I led a 3-hour workshop with men around undoing patriarchy and revealing the sacred masculine. And some of the men that I've been working with since February here, doing this work. And undoing patriarchy is work that I've been doing for several years, especially since the 2016 elections, post-elections, where I felt that it was really so much of my responsibility as a male-identified person, as a cisgendered man, to actually begin to offer training support for men wanting finally to really undo patriarchy, to get into the ways in which we've been conditioned to first and foremost hate ourselves, and to use that hate to perpetuate abuse and violence for not for other men, but especially for women, femme-identified folks, trans gender folks, and non-gender conforming folks. And and then Monday we kind of finished up with an evening talk at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, which I love, teaching in really interesting places. And we explored fierce love, and really getting into this conversation around love, and really love and death, love and impermanence, love and woundedness, actually.
Mm,
Um, and
mm.
so that was a lot of work over the past few days.
I would say you're a busy, busy man. Love and woundedness. That's
Yeah.
quite something.
Hmm.
Thinking about love and woundedness from the perspective of being, me, Francesca Maximé in Brooklyn, and
Hmm.
Lama Rod Owens, currently located in California, right, for the day.
Hmm.
Um, and yet all of the stuff that has come before us and all of the
Yeah.
ways in which that it's not just a local wounding
Hmm.
or a local loving, but it's an intergenerational or transgenerational or
Yeah.
a panoramic kind of ways in
Hmm.
which we're wounded and healed, or
Hmm.
I don't really love that word healing, but we're,
Hmm.
sort
Hmm.
of repaired, I don't know,
Yeah.
recovered
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
relationship also.
Yeah.
Um, and, and,
Yeah.
and I feel like that practice is a process of moving through grief or something, like
Yeah.
mourning or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, tell me your
Hmm.
insights on that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I just you know, for me, it's about being okay. And for me, when I am okay, I am in balance, right? And so balance doesn't necessarily mean that I am comfortable, that I'm like loving the world or I'm enjoying anything. It means that I am in a position where I'm able to hold the space for myself, and I'm not being distracted by the sensations of pain or uneasiness. Those sensations, those experiences are there. But I'm able to be with them. And
Yeah,
if I'm not able to be with those sensations, if I have to enter into an experience of disembodiment or disassociation, I can know that, and that's still, in a way, being okay. And that, of course, all comes from this sense of mindfulness, sense of awareness, where we're just trying to show up to what we're experiencing. We don't have to like what we're showing up to, but
yes,
we just have to try or have at least the aspiration to show up to it. And so, I've been working with trauma for years and studying trauma formally. And, have been really exploring specifically transhistorical trauma, and as people who are descended from slaves, the point of our transhistorical trauma was really the Middle Passage, and how that middle passage became an energetic kind of disruption, that's been actually passed from generation to generation, which has been um, uh, deepened by systematic oppression, by racism, by misogyny, by homophobia, by queerness, and so forth and so on. And so much of my work, and this is the work that I'm hoping to promote more and more as I deepen my teaching, is to help people to understand that, like, this is our work to disrupt the transference of trauma into the next generation.
I
And
love
this
that.
is the work not only that we're doing for the next generation, it's the work that we're doing on behalf of our ancestors who are themselves are
Yes.
still in trauma.
Yes. Yes.
So
No, just finish.
no, well, really quickly, I was going to say, that, it is the ethical responsibility of the living, particularly as descendants of slaves, to do the unfinished work of returning back to a sense of equilibrium, to a sense of okayness, because we have the opportunity, we have the privilege in this body, in this life, to do the work of liberation from trauma.
Hear, hear. Hella yes. Yes, and yes, and yes. And, I love the way that it's really like, my mom always used to say to me, she's the Italian side,
Mhm.
uh, always said, noblesse oblige, too much is given, too much is expected, or, you
Yeah.
basically like have to do stuff
Hmm. Hmm.
when you're given opportunity. And I also hear you saying it in a way that, like, we have to stand accountable. Like, this reckoning has to take
Yeah.
place. This is
Yeah.
something that can't just be like spiritually bypassed,
Yeah.
pre-forgiven, like I like to say,
Hmm.
hopped over,
Hmm.
jumped ahead on. And that while it isn't necessarily easy, simple, like in your messy conversations with your radical Dharma book, it's very, it is whatever it is. It's going to look,
Yeah.
different every day and in every different way. But that it is our responsibility, because we're here now, because that's
Hmm.
the eternal now, but that the healing works both ways.
Yeah.
Or it works, it's like a trifecta of healing, now,
Yeah.
past, and future.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the fact that we need to do that in a way that makes sense for us, right?
Hmm.
But that at the end of the day, you can't escape it. Like, you're going to hit
No.
a certain amount of pay dirt where there's that reckoning.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
how holding it maybe together while
Hmm.
doing individual work can be
Yes.
a real way to help oneself
Mhm.
collectively, do that, so you don't feel so
Absolutely.
alone.
Absolutely. Hmm. Yeah.
That feels important.
I think it's detrimental right now. I think we're living in a time and in a place where the level of trauma as well as PTSD is palpable. We feel it in our minds and our bodies, but we feel it in the earth, and it is something that's also held in the air that we're breathing. It is in the water. It's in all the elements. This is a world that is um, saturated by disequilibrium,
Right.
imbalance of disassociation.
Yeah.
Um,
Don't get me started on dissociation, because my whole thing about that is the collective dissociation is what happens when you do the colonization, when you come in
yeah,
and you create
yeah,
fissure where there was none, when you
yes,
basically
exactly.
frack a people, when you
Yeah.
essentially, put stuff where it's not supposed to be or doesn't
Hmm.
naturally evolve from, you're
Hmm.
necessarily going to create separation. And then I know, Dharma teacher Tara Brach talks a lot about
Uh-huh.
separation as the whole, like, that's the thing, like, we feel separate but we're not. Well, yes, but if we're not interrogating the constructs around that, enslavement, the middle passage, genocide, indigenous genocide, that at a certain level, we can't just walk around and assume that, well, those things didn't happen or we got
Right.
over them and they don't live in us as part of what our dissociative experiences are, which could be eating the
Right.
bag of Oreos. Not that there's
Yeah.
anything against Oreos, but if
Right.
it's a dissociative experience around eating them, okay, well, then you can even, as you said, be aware of that
Yeah.
and still do it. But you could
Yeah.
also opt to maybe not.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
And I mean, I guess I just feel like interrogating the whiteness piece, the white racial supremacy, white body supremacy piece around that
Hmm.
also is important for folks who are lighter white skin privileged. I mean, you're saying
Yeah.
it's the healing of people of color, but I also feel like, what is it like to be the colonizer and have to hold that? Or the
Yeah.
inheritor of that, even if
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's everyone's in trauma, regardless of race. The colonized and the colonizer, right? But the colonizer is perpetually in a state of disassociation, which allows the colonizer to do the work of colonizing. We
Yeah.
just had, Indigenous Peoples Day, which was formerly Columbus Day. And then you read the accounts of Christopher Columbus, and you go, how could this person possibly get a holiday? What kind of people would honor a man who oversaw and perpetuated such violence, on a community of people? you know that's the height of disassociation, when I can do anything that I want to you and it doesn't bother me and I can just continue doing it. you know But then I think about Paulo Freire, where he talks about in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where it's the oppressed who will liberate the oppressor. And what
Yeah.
I understand that to mean in a trauma perspective is that it will be the work of the oppressed or the colonized to return back to their bodies in order to reflect what embodiment looks like back to the
I
colonizer,
love
to the
that.
oppressor.
Mm.
Like we're struggling, we're engaged in this project to continually move through the impacts of colonization, of oppression. And it's that struggle that actually is helping us to experience more and more freedom along this path, a freedom that our colonizers or white people or anyone in a position that is creating violence is not experiencing. you know but to be reminded of, as an oppressor, as a colonizer, to be reminded of the body is also to be reminded of, that deep pain.
Mm.
And that brings me to like this personal, I don't know, struggle, which is, do do white people, do anyone in a colonizer or oppressor position have the capacity to turn back into not only their trauma and PTSD, but also the inherited transhistorical trauma and PTSD from their ancestors? How do you just start doing that work? And when I reflect on that, my heart softens, right? Because I understand the immense difficulty of doing that. You know, like, I'm fortunate to be born in this body and in the skin, because suffering isn't new to me. Suffering has been with me since the day that I was born. I was taught to be in a relationship to suffering. It wasn't a liberatory relationship, but I was taught to be aware, to know it. And when I came into Dharma and meditation, I was taught the tools to actually transform that relationship even
Mm.
more to something that felt more open, spacious, free, kinder. And I could find the joy within that kind of new relationship making within Dharma. But so much of our work is really trying to convince white people, men, to actually uh, do the work of returning back to that pain. And also beyond that, helping them to understand that they can. they can survive that turning back. And
Yeah.
this is why Dharma is so imperative right now, because I think it offers us the tools to help us turn back into what we habitually run away from. Um, and it helps us understand that we're not going to lose, we don't have to lose ourselves in that turning back, that we have the energy to consume this pain, this chaos, instead of it always perpetually consuming us.
Right. And in that consumption, if we're just going to go with the food analogy, because when I consume a bagel, it goes in my mouth and it goes out my butt, because that's what happens when I consume something. So it doesn't
Yeah,
stay in me,
yeah,
but it gets processed
yeah,
differently, and that energy
yeah.
is used in a different way.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that idea of consuming around, you're not being eaten up, you're eating in, it's sort of like a Tonglen practice in a way,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're breathing in the suffering, you're breathing out the compassion. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
believe you're the Tibetan Buddhist, but I believe that's
Yeah.
a basic Tonglen
Exactly.
practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
that you're processing it, but that you're being held somehow in the middle. And for me, and when I work with if I'm doing like more psychotherapy with folks, I'll call them clients or patients, or if I'm teaching, mindfulness or something, I'll say students or
Mm-hmm.
just people, right? Just people,
Mm-hmm.
because I've yet to figure out how to teach a cat. They usually teach me things um, that the part that gets stuck is folks have a difficulty, in my experience, believing
Mm-hmm.
that there's a floor, that there's a them, that there's a unus of
Yeah.
you, that there's an essence of you that's unbroken, that that's okayness underneath all of the
Mm-hmm.
tornado of suffering and chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you start to touch into it and you feel into shame, or you feel into I'm a terrible person, or I'm not supposed to be here, I'm bad, if you are the inheritor of the colonizer, part of the colonization,
Mm-hmm.
that if there's no floor there, if you don't feel like there's any unus of you there,
Mm-hmm.
that turning away from, um, it just happens, because it just feels like you're just going to get swallowed up.
Yeah.
And so how do you practice for
Mm-hmm.
folks
Mm-hmm.
that touching
Mm-hmm.
into that essential nature
Mm-hmm.
that is there, that is almost like a leap of faith?
Yeah. 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 And that's really hard to do. It's really hard just to tell people, okay, just turn back into the pain,
Yeah.
you know. So I never try to do that, always, as I say all the time, I try to offer a spoonful of sugar
Yes,
to make the medicine go down.
you are a spoonful and then some of sugar yourself. So if they're
Yeah.
sitting with you and you're holding space with them, I
uh,
think it's probably easier.
yeah. Yeah. And like in my training with my teachers, none of my teachers gave me a spoonful of sugar. They gave me a spoonful of vinegar to make it worse, because because they're like, no, but samsara is actually worse, so you need to like actually just wake up and just deal with it. But that was the teaching that I needed. Like, I'm just like straightforward. So
Mm.
often, I have to step back and realize, oh, people need more support. So this is, what I do really on the ground is I always say that, like, you need to call in what you need to do the work,
Yeah.
of moving into this energy. And so I have, this is all, so much coming out of the work that I've done around trauma, both personally and, working with my trauma, but also in my study and writing of trauma, where I offer a structure to help people move into energy. So these structures are based upon, loving kindness practice or metta practices. I have a practice called the 7 Homecomings, which is really imperative. And it's just the practice where we call in these beings that love us. We acknowledge the earth under us. We acknowledge the kinds of teachings that deeply inspire us. And it creates a container for us that's filled with this intense energy of care. And so I ask people to move into what seems difficult, but doing so in a way where they always feel supported by this energy of care.
Yeah.
from these beings around them. And so, and always reminding people that they're titrating, right? They're touching in, then moving out, touching in, moving out, right? And that's the point, the heart of what we're trying to do is create the space around the difficult stuff, and to also create choices and how we are going to relate to that. And for me, that's like the basic principles of working with trauma: space and choice.
Mm, mm, mm.
You know, um,
Yeah, and if you're calling it, we call that in my trainings like resources, and
oh yeah,
you can, and whatever it is. I mean, when I work with folks, it's like it could be your cat, it's your dog Willow,
yeah,
it's your grandma
yep,
who's been deceased, it's your deity, it's
exactly.
your stuffed
Mm-hmm.
animal, it's the Incredible Hulk or Wonder Woman or whatever. One of my clients, it was Zorro.
Uh-huh.
So I'm like, great.
Sometimes it's Beyonce.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and then call in the Bayhive, because then you have like, then you have like a massive amount of followers. And actually, in processing a trauma memory, one of my clients actually brought in like her cheerleading team, like her, you know what I
Oh
mean?
wow,
Like
yeah.
literally having cheerleaders, like, and like literally having people like reflect back, like,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's not okay. And yes, I
Mm-hmm.
need, and whatever it is that these are things that in our brains, in our imaginal world, and this as a visualization practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
our brains are funny. They
Mm-hmm.
like it when we give them nice food, even if it's calorie free, meaning that
Mm-hmm.
it's a made up story that we're making up in the present moment that
Mm-hmm.
isn't what actually happened back at the point of trauma, but the one that it wants to hear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They
Yep.
like that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Um, so this piece about homecoming practices, I really appreciate, and I guess that's where I kind of fall short with this idea of self-compassion versus self, mm, sort of just self-celebration in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I
Mm-hmm.
always feel like we want to be compassionate to the conditioning and the behavior that we've
Yeah.
adopted in order to be adaptive, because
Mm-hmm.
behaviorally that can show up in the world that causes harm to ourselves or others in ways that we don't have full agency, to your point, and choice and consciousness around. But that if there's really at foundational level, like the eunice of you, that there's nothing wrong with, I'm like, well, you don't really have, I mean, it's kind of redundant to be compassionate to that, because that's almost the
Right.
compassion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Not that
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
it's more like verbiage, but anyway, that's just
Mm-hmm.
like a thing for me. Any thoughts on that or no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that like we have to. Well, so you point out something really important, which is that. So I can sit around in teachings and whatever and just like throw out a bunch of language, But for me, what has been most important is for me to reclaim language and to say, you know what, this is what this means for me. So like every time people come, they sit with me, I always say, you know what, take this and use it in whatever way you need to, and you can frame this in different language, whatever. Figure out what makes sense for you. Because all I'm doing is just offering something that has made sense for me from my
Mm,
practice.
mm,
Again, that's like the sense of choice. You have a choice, right? And it's so funny, people are so conditioned to do what you say, you
yeah,
know,
like to the T.
to the T, and then as a teacher, then I've had to be like, oh, like I need to always remind people that they have agency to do something different,
Yeah, to
you
shape it the
know?
way it works for them.
Yeah. Because I just naturally always had that. Like I'm naturally very hard-headed and opinionated, and critical, and judgmental and all of that, whatever. I own it. And so I brought that into my practice. I brought that into working with teachers where I was like, oh, like this is what the teacher said, but this is what I actually need to do. You
Mm,
know, that's important. And I think a good teacher or even a good therapist will have the wisdom to understand that the student or the patient is actually integrating in a way that can be sustainable for them over time.
yeah. right? Because isn't it that sustainability that's so critical, right? I mean, because
Yeah.
we're here for as long as we're here, but we would
Yeah.
like to not just have it be a one-shot wonder where we
Yeah.
feel good one day and
Yeah.
forget how to return to balance
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah. Exactly.
We want to
Yeah.
try to remember
I think,
that.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's what we're always trying, at least what I'm always trying to do is I want people to be well, and I don't want people to be dependent on me, So I am like deeply, deeply like a practice based person. I believe in my practice and my teaching ethic. It's like, here's all these things. Like, here are all, and there's so many things. I want you to take this and practice with it, because it is your practice and it is your inherent wisdom that's actually your teacher, and if you can connect to that, then that will be a path that will lead you even into the process of death and dying and
Yeah.
beyond. If you can cultivate that sense of like agency and self-reliance, but self-reliance on this inherent intrinsic wisdom and clarity that's inherent in every being, you know
I love that. And hence
yeah.
the former name of this podcast, Wise Girl or Wise Guy.
Yes.
And, like I said earlier, like your own inner wisdom, your own inner child, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it, that own inner knowing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Joseph Goldstein talks about it's the
Yeah.
knowing, the knowing
Yeah.
quality,
Yeah.
and it's not knowing like a thing, right? Because we know things aren't fixed. It's the knowing, the capacity, the process of the one that's always accessing, receiving, processing, moving through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, Beautiful. Okay, so maybe switching gears a little bit to talk a little bit about some of your new projects, like your book. I know you're
Yeah.
working on something that,
Mm-hmm.
again, folks who can't maybe see you at a retreat as you are now
Yeah.
in LA
Yeah.
can read. You've already written Radical Dharma with your
Yeah.
fellow co-authors, but what else is next?
Yeah. Yeah. So my next book, coming out in June, is called Love and Rage.
Love and
And
Rage.
Love and Rage. Yeah. And that book came out of a lot of the intense energy we were feeling post election. And like many people, you know, felt as if I had to scramble to create these solutions to survive, you know. And I was sitting with a lot of people, working with a lot of people. I had started a series of workshops called, around activism and mindfulness, because everyone all of a sudden was interested in activism. you
Yeah,
know,
well, I
like
wonder why.
everyone.
Yeah.
I know. So we were doing that. I just felt like that wasn't enough, and I remember having to kind of slow down, and remember that, like, I remember on the day of the elections, I called my mother, and of course, like, I'm like freaking out, right? I'm just like, this is the end of the world. And she was like, basically, she's like, oh yeah, I'm fine. you
Yeah,
know,
wow.
she was like, her life was continuing. And I was like, and it was so grounding for me, to say, oh, like, this is samsara. This is like what is supposed to happen. Like, I have what I need. Like my teacher would say, whatever happens, happens, whatever comes, comes. I don't need anything at all, And so, like, in the middle of 2017, I just kind of came to this place where I was like, no, my activism, yeah, yeah, I have to be out on the streets as much as possible, but my activism is also holding space for myself and for others around us, because everyone was like freaking out, flipping out,
Yeah.
And still are, and so the book emerged from that, and emerged from this incredible amount of woundedness that people were experiencing but couldn't name, and this incredible amount of anger that people felt suffocated by, and I couple that with what I felt to be the heart of how to hold space, which is deeply embodying love, and so the book is really examining, not just anger, like anger and rage, but it's actually looking at the woundedness beneath our anger and all the storylines and narratives
Mm.
around that woundedness. Um, and um, and so, yeah, then I committed myself to writing that book, which was like difficult to do, because I felt like I was creating somewhat of a new language to talk about this. It's so interesting when you're writing books. You write a book and you've spent so much time with it. This was the same case with Radical Dharma. Where you spend so actually Radical Dharma is very quick. We turned that around in like less than a year. But when you spend so much time with the text, you forget that you have to give that text away to the world.
Right.
But you get bored with it. Like I get bored with it. I'm like, oh, this is so boring. But when that book is published, right, then it takes on a different life. And it's like ascending up, when you get on a roller coaster and that first like climb up the first hill, and then when you get to the top of the hill and you like, slam down into like the first drop. That's how releasing a book feels. It's like the book just gets scattered out into the world and you're like holding on,
Yes.
and saying, what is happening? You're just like screaming, and then you get used to it, you know? So yeah, so that's the book. I think it's going to be a really different take on things. I think I have a really interesting perspective. It's a really vulnerable book for me.
Mm.
I really get into my experience with depression. I get into sexuality, gender. I get into sex. Of course, there's the anger piece as well. But I talk about trauma, particularly trans-historical trauma. And it's a book that I wrote to first and foremost Black people, Black folks, my community, but also to activists, to the queer community, to the trans and gender non-conforming community. The book is for anyone that struggles. I see it as like a love song,
Mm.
for people, and it's going to be a very different Dharma book as well. I want the book, in many ways, like Radical Dharma, to be accessible across belief systems, across communities, across religions and spiritualities, as well.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I think that that's you. I mean, I think that that's just
Yeah.
sort of the way you do your teaching and sharing and
Mm,
living is that.
mm,
I
yeah.
don't know that anyone who is light skin or white skin privilege identified, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it, who's saying, oh, I
Yeah.
can't sit with Lama Rod, or,
Exactly.
someone who's like a trans, uh, you
Yeah.
know, Asian,
Mm,
woman is just
mm,
be like, well, I can sit with Lama Rod. Like, it's not,
mm.
or some people are just like, well, I don't want to sit with that person. I don't feel like comfortable.
Exactly.
You do
Yeah.
hold space, I think, for create an inviting, invitational, welcoming space for all kinds of folks and identities, which I think is one of your gifts, one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And now, it's so bizarre. It's like when I finished the first draft in May, I was like, there's no way I'm gonna write a book ever again. you know? And now I'm beginning to write my next book.
Oh,
And this book is really on something that I thought I wouldn't be able to get to for years and years, but I'm going to actually get into into the body and sexual expression,
mm,
and everything in pornography, um, plant medicine. I mean, this is I just want to get into these taboo things within our communities. And for me, this is a continuing project with transhistorical trauma because part of our trauma is this belief that we don't have agency over our bodies. That comes from our slave ancestors who, their agency was taken away from them. That's what slavery was.
right.
You take away one's agency over their bodies, and that's a trauma that's been transferred.
It's so true. And I'm just thinking, I mean, talk about self-disclosure,
Yeah.
TMI podcast listeners, here it comes. So I'm like on a date last
Yeah.
weekend and,
Yeah.
it was first date and, we're sort of, kind of getting hot and heavy. And I'm just like, yeah, no, I'm not
Yeah.
sleeping with you,
Yeah.
not because I didn't want to, not because I didn't like have a hormonal thing that was like saying,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, go for it. It's fine. Not because I haven't gotten rid of some of my, old school kind of like, oh, don't be slutty or don't be whatever, like,
Yeah.
like whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
honestly, it was two things. It was one, like when I felt like I stopped becoming a person to this person,
Yeah.
and I sort of felt like I started just becoming like, it's like the craving, right? Like
Uh-huh.
their craving was greater than my ability to have space to move into, to then step in and choose agency there
Mm-hmm.
around like, I want to be with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I, in the sense of like,
Mm-hmm.
you want to take me, and that's fine. I mean, it's nice to be desired. And I
Sure.
would like to be
Mm-hmm.
with you, but there's no space in between. I
Yeah.
can't come into you. I
Yeah.
can't come to you. I
Mm-hmm.
can't have my agency if everything about your construct is winning and dominance and, you know, and
Yeah.
and so reclaiming this space to me has often been
Mm-hmm.
about, unfortunately, saying no,
Yeah.
right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
often the experience historically of, I'll just say it, like women, right? Like Me
Yeah.
Too, like
Right.
whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
could be anyone.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas, making time for joy and making time for space, I want to create it to be able to step in and say yes, right? Like I want to
Yeah.
be able to say, like, I know I have agency and I want to be able to move into this with,
Yeah.
does this make any sense, or am I sounding?
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
like for me on that means it has to have more of a systemic change where the system embodied in this one particular person last
Mm-hmm.
weekend of
Mm-hmm.
patriarchy, which I think this particular body was holding,
Yeah.
is mitigated, is lessened, because
Yeah.
then it would more intuitively know, hey, I need to create a little bit more space here so this
Yeah.
person can move in, and then we both get more of what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then like so then that a person who is trapped in that kind of patriarchal mindset, they themselves have no agency over their bodies. You know, there's no compassion for themselves or their bodies either. And of
Mm,
course, it goes back to colonizer, and colonized. It's like I have a right to colonize. This is what patriarchy is. Like I, as a male identified person, I have a right to colonize the world. I have the right to get what I want from anybody that I come in contact with. And I've been taught that that's okay. And so when there's resistance, I think, oh, you're disrupting this natural order. So
yes,
you
and I
have to
was
be
like,
subdued.
right, so annoying.
And that's the heart of all the violence. That's like this tendency for me to believe that when you resist or when you say no, then you're like disrupting the natural order of something. When in fact, this natural order is actually wrong to begin with. It's
Yeah.
not natural, actually, you know? And then I feel validated to move through those boundaries because I believe there is a moral, ethical, mandate for me to do this because that's what I've been told.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the world is supposed to be mine and the world resists, then I have a right to subdue the world.
Right.
You know.
And fortunately, in my case, in this example, it wasn't, it was subtly violent in the ways of just, not
Yeah.
having but it wasn't, although I've
Mm-hmm.
been subjected to the other things that were,
Mm-hmm.
which is also not cool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and traumatic, and
Yeah.
the recovery continues. And so but around that piece, one of my teachers, Terry Real, calls it
Mm-hmm.
privileged obliviousness,
Mm-hmm.
sort of
Mm-hmm.
this entitlement piece or this grandiosity piece that's kind of built in or baked into stuff. And then you're going to hear people, maybe if they probably won't be the ones listening to this podcast, but they might be like, oh, you're man haters, or you're, white man
Yeah.
hater, or then there's that
Yeah.
argument. And I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it's a system that
Yeah.
lives in people who get born into this structure
Exactly.
that then, when it's not decalcified, manifests in ways that can be not so great.
Exactly. Exactly. You know. And there's this whole phenomenon happening, which I don't get, as a person of color, where white men feel as if they're being oppressed.
Yeah, that's the new one. Yeah.
That's the new one. And, in this movie, The Joker, I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine out here who's in the film industry. We're just talking about like that movie and how, it's working right now, in the industry, and it's like, this like narrative that perpetuates this idea that like a white man, and I'll also generalize and say men in general are under attack, and that's a very, very dangerous narrative because it distracts us from the systematic realness of patriarchal abuse, particularly by cisgender men and male identified folks, you know.
Let me ask you this. I've been told by one of my teachers that I respect, and I believe it
Yeah.
to be true in
Yeah.
some ways, and in much the same way you say it is the responsibility of people of color to
Yeah.
reckon with their trauma around the Middle Passage and
Yes.
transgenerational,
Yeah.
that really that the fourth wave of feminism will be about being more man loving and being more about loving firmness and being around the idea of having this idea where we're willing to be teaching. We're not just resentful. We're not just resentful on the back end. We've come into our own. We say our wants and needs up front. We're okay with limits and boundaries. And we're also willing to do some of the emotional labor of teaching you how to do it, which is kind of like what you were saying is if a person of color is embodied and knows how to have joy and does dance and does show up and is recovering from the trauma that in this example that you had given, lighter white skin privilege inheritors of the colonization will then see that and witness that and say, oh, I don't know how to do this quite yet, but someone's doing it, and can I have some of that? Or and is that how does that set with you that it's
I think
or is it a both and?
I think it's both then, but like I don't know. As you were sharing that, the thing that came to mind was, and this is really complex, and this is kind of what I'm trying to do within Undoing Patriarchy work, but like I think that if I can articulate this, that particularly from the tradition of Tantric Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, we understand that like real change doesn't happen until it happens on the energetic level, and on the energetic level, there is an expression of energy that in one way is gendered, but it has nothing to do with gender at the same time, and I think that for the future, I think that the movement has to go inward to affect the energy, but it also has, for all of us, the work has to be recognizing that we embody all forms of energy, masculine and feminine energy, and to love those energies that we habitually push away. So like for me, my practice for years has been coming into contact with this feminine energy, and making a home in that energy. And I think the feminine energy begins to balance out even this masculine energy. And there's an equilibrium that I'm coming into, And it doesn't mean that like I'm entering into the space of being gender non-conforming or non-binary. It's actually not, it's much more subtle than that. And I think that's where the work is for us in this next wave. And I think when we do that natural acceptance and deep energetic work, then we just kind of love everyone. We begin to love men and their violence. We don't love the violence, but we begin to love the person who is lost in their ignorance and who is actually perpetrating that violence out of ignorance.
And how do you live relationally with that person?
Well, the only way you can live relationally is first and foremost through boundaries, right? Like I can love you, but you don't get to do what you want, right? But like those boundaries, I think have to be erected in order to act as a mirror that reflects people's violence back to them, It's like, no, I can't live with you, and it, you have to actually acknowledge this boundary. And as you acknowledge this boundary, then you're gonna have to see the ways in which you make it hard for me to be around you. These boundaries that just didn't come from nowhere, right? They came out of my lived experience of being around you. So stuff like that kind of like understanding how to want people to be happy, to be free from suffering, but also knowing that I too want to be happy and free from suffering, right?
Yeah.
It has to be both,
Right.
for us. And I think loving those who are violent doesn't mean I love myself less.
No.
You know, um, I think that's the subtlety that I think that which many of us are trying to still work with, as well. Um, Sometimes love means that I have to go away. You know, I have to have distance because I need to minimize the ways in which you're able to hurt me and to hurt others. And that's out of love for you.
It is out of love for you.
You know.
Yeah. Yes. And again, that's back to my whole sort of thing that makes me kind of sad, although it's really where we're at, which is that it's about limits and boundaries and
Yeah.
not that we don't need them, but that it's about without constriction, but restriction.
Right.
It's
Right.
about containment,
Restriction.
not, do you know what I mean? It's this sort of the difference between containment and rigidity, that there's
Yes. Yes.
you're like, hell yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
and I think that that's what's so subtle. And the sadness for me is that my natural tendency is as a human, and I think generally speaking for a lot of humans,
Hmm.
is to want
Hmm.
to be generously compassionate, and um especially for folks who aren't cis hetero male identified, that are
Yeah.
deeply deeply ingrained with boy code from the get-go
Hmm.
around not having a heart, just like women are
Yeah.
deeply ingrained about not having a voice,
Yeah.
to quote Carol Gilligan.
Yeah.
That there's really there's a sadness that I have around, like, in order for me to have a place in your world, I need to withhold. I need
Yeah.
to be contained. It makes you feel safer when I'm not generous. And this is
Yeah.
it's not an across the board always dynamic, but it's an
Right.
often dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, and also maybe for me, it's this wisdom that helps me to understand that, like, not everyone in my life is able or has the capacity or has even earned the right to hold my fullness.
Can you repeat that, please, for
Okay, so
this
it just
listener?
came to me.
Not
So
everyone
is
is capable or
so
has
not
the right.
everyone,
Go ahead, you tell
right?
me.
Okay, so not everyone is capable, has the right, or has earned the right to hold my fullness. And that's about understanding how to avoid suffering, how to avoid getting hurt. As Brene Brown talks about, it's like there's only like one or two people that you can be completely 100% vulnerable with, and they have had to earn that through a lot of work, you know? And I think from there, like in my work, I go a little further and say, there's a stratification, there are levels of people that have earned different levels of vulnerability. And so that has to be the case, because if I love myself, I'm also interested in remaining free from violence, and I do that by understanding that, like, I can only reveal myself to the people who have the maturity to hold me. If that's not the case, then I get hurt. You know,
Yeah,
so
that's
I
real.
know that, yeah, and I know who those people are. And often these days I can feel very, very early on in meeting someone if they're able to hold me. 'Cause I can feel how people adapt. I can feel people's reflexivity, just in like how they move through the world. I can feel that really early on in my relationship to people, So that's a way in which people are earning vulnerability, by showing that like they can hold things by being adaptable and, and flexible.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and I appreciate that, and I know we're starting to kind of wind down
Hmm.
and close out. The last point you mentioned, vulnerability. Um, I feel like intimacy and vulnerability are really, really
Uh-huh.
close together, but I also
Mhm.
feel like, in my experience of late, people are starting to equate, or maybe they have for a long time, and I'm just noticing it now.
Uh-huh.
Uh, when they say, I want you to be vulnerable, or it's okay to be vulnerable, or I only feel safe when you are vulnerable, or when you're more vulnerable, it
Yeah.
makes me feel safer. But
Yeah.
they don't really mean vulnerability. What I think
Mm.
they mean
Mhm.
is shame,
Uh-huh.
self effacement, or some kind of
Uh-huh.
like, I'm not going to, that they're sort of an unchecked, like, it's not just about vulnerability, because
Yeah.
vulnerability can also be in your glory. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be in your depths of sadness and darkness,
Mhm.
but it's
Mhm.
often equated with that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you say shame, so when people are saying vulnerability, you're saying that people are instead talking about shame.
I think often they are. And I don't
Mm.
think that that's because when I talk about vulnerability, I talk
Yeah.
about showing up in a way that I can be fully intimate with myself and with others
Right.
without
Right.
pretense and without,
Yeah.
and I don't think that those folks can be intimate.
Oh.
And
Uh-huh.
so I think what they're really asking for is,
Mhm.
something that resembles vulnerability, but is more
Yeah.
rooted in shame, because that's what makes
Yeah.
them feel more comfortable.
Yeah. 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 So, yeah, I totally resonate with that, because I think in my experience, it's vulnerability is a really powerful word. So when people say vulnerability, it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, how far? We don't talk about like the levels of vulnerability, you know? And vulnerability is something that we have to earn from one another. It's not something that I can just say, be vulnerable. It's a process, and sometimes if we're with people in relationships where we may have been doing the work to be really trustworthy and really open, and we may be vulnerable ourselves. We have to kind of understand too that like people are that shame is actually the one thing that keeps us from being vulnerable, because we've all been hurt, and that hurt is actually informing a lived experience of being with someone, and we have to be patient with that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes too, if you've worked through some of the work, like you talk about,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you are in post-traumatic stress recovery and not just
Yeah.
post-traumatic stress,
Mhm.
that sometimes the confidence or the inner wisdom or the connection with self
Yeah.
around stuff can be, while honest
Mhm.
confidence or honest
Mhm.
self-esteem can be interpreted as
Mhm.
more of arrogance or something, or right,
Yeah.
like, which,
Exactly.
and I don't get that either. I mean, like, that's
Yeah.
sad to me too.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so I guess I would just, yeah, that those are just a couple things I've been reflecting on lately also.
Yeah.
How can you be in your
Yeah.
power and take your seat in the midst of it all, noble and dignified, as Jack says, Cornfield, my teacher, and I'm sure many before him, and have that be okay.
Yeah. Well, because like that self-confidence actually reminds people of their lack of self-confidence. You know, and we all, like many of us, not all of us, but many of us have a really ambiguous, confused relationship with our own self-power. Again, I think that comes from being hurt by power. And like I think our work is to be in power with ourselves and thus in power with others around us.
Yeah.
Because power isn't going to go away. It's not going to disappear ever. So how can we balance it out in our relationships with one another, where I'm not trying to like dominate you, nor am I trying to be, submit to you or be subdued by you. I'm just trying to hold my space with you. And I want to know what that looks like. And I want to be in, I don't know, a dialogue with like what that looks like moment to moment, to be in power with ourselves and to be in power with simultaneously with other people around us.
Beautiful. On that note, to be in power with ourselves and to be in
Mm.
power simultaneously with those around us in a relational and embodied, grounded, and connected way here on the ReRooted podcast. Lama Rod Owens, I am so thrilled that you're here. And I would like to give a special shout out to the fly in LA that has been buzzing around
I
you
know.
all podcast that listeners will not be able to notice was here, but viewers will, and how
Yeah.
you skillfully, through all of your mindful, there he is, or she,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that this is what we do when we sit in long retreats and just sort of learn to coexist with that which is otherwise somewhat irritating and annoying. And I think that was kind of a good metaphor
Yep.
for what we've been talking about anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So the book is out in June.
Yep.
Love and Anger?
Love and Rage.
Love and Rage. Love and
Yep.
Rage out in June, and then the next one to come after that. Lama
Yep.
Rod Owens, thank you so much for joining us here on ReRooted, the Be Here Now Network. I'm Francesca Maximé. We'll talk again, I'm sure. Take good care.
Thank you.